Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for session 2 of our Restraint Reduction Dissemination Day series. Today we're going to be looking at another journal article. This one, we've got the details on the screen now. It's by Weber, Richardson, Lambrick and Fester. It was published in the Build International Journal of Positive Behavioural Support back in 2012. And the title of the journal article is The Impact of the Quality of Behaviour Support Plans on the Use of Restraint and Seclusion in Disability Services. We're sort of looking at building upon the journal article that Tia was reviewing during the last session, which looked at a sort of a service-wide implementation of positive behaviour support and the positive outcomes that came from that. This one is a really neat study that focuses on one particular element within that. The researchers wanted to build on previous evidence gathered in other studies that looked at alternative outcomes to behaviour support planning. But what the researchers really sort of wanted to focus upon was the fact that reductions in challenging behaviour aren't the only measure of success. I think sometimes we can too often focus only on the challenging behaviour and not on other elements that might be related to that. So, for example, reductions in restrictive interventions, increased opportunities to acquire skills, choice and self-determination, human rights being respected, and all of these really feeding into that underlying element that we focus on in positive behaviour support, which is a good quality of life. The researchers are actually building upon another piece of research that they carried out the year previous, in 2011, where they did find a tentative support for a link between quality and reduced restrictive interventions in relation to behaviour support plans. They used the Behaviour Support Plan Quality Evaluation tool, the BSP-QE2. They found that behaviour support plans resulting in fewer restrictive interventions were an average of higher quality, but that was more of a general finding. What the researchers were really interested in examining within this study is whether there are particular components within the quality evaluation that lead to reductions in restrictive intervention. I think another interesting thing is the context in which the study took place. The research took place in Australia and Victoria specifically, where they've got legislation in place. All people receiving a government-funded service who is subject to a restrictive intervention must have a behaviour support plan. That copy must be sent to the senior practitioner and be approved to be used. And they then must report any use of restrictive interventions to that government office. So this is a process of monitoring and reviewing that's going on from a legislative point of view, which is quite different, I think, to what we have over in the UK. And what this gave rise to was a really interesting opportunity for the researchers to have access to the behaviour support plans linking to people who were subject to restrictive interventions, and also it gave them access to the restrictive intervention monitoring. So therefore it was a really useful opportunity to gather this information with quite a large sort of sample size. So moving on now to look at the methodology of this study. It was conducted within that context with the legislative oversight from the Victoria Government. This meant that the researchers had access to all of the plans that were sent to the Office of the Senior Practitioner. 1/3 of those plans were randomly selected to be reviewed for quality using the methods that we'll describe in a minute, between July 2010 and June 2011. That totalled 198 different behaviour support plans relating to 198 different individuals. 67% of those are male and 33% were female. The behaviour support plans used in the study were evaluated using the BSP-QE2 that I referred to a little bit earlier on during this presentation. This was devised by Browning and colleagues back in 2003, and it's an objective assessment of 12 evidence-based quality components of behaviour support planning. So each of those individual 12 components could be scored between 0 and 2. And in terms of overall ratings, so how the researchers actually defined the behaviour support plans, those behaviour support plans that scored a score less than 13 were rated as low quality, and those that scored 13 or above were rated as high quality. The dependent variable, so the thing that was being measured in the study, was the restrictive intervention usage following the implementation of the plan. So moving on to look at some of the results. The first thing they did was look at some demographic differences between the two groups, just to try and rule out any other confounding variables that might be having an impact on the use of restrictive interventions. They found that there were no significant differences in terms of gender, age or disability type between the two groups. They did find that there were some significant differences in terms of where those people were being supported. So individuals with high quality behaviour support plans were more likely to be living in institutions within the community. Looking at the next graph, and as I say, I've taken these specifically from the journal article because I think they're really well presented. This next graph I really like. It's looking at the 12 components within the BSP QE2 in relation to the scoring that was given to each behaviour support plan. So along the bottom there you see the 12 different components. If we look at the description of the behaviour, which is component 1, over 80% of the plans were adequately described. They had adequate descriptions of behaviour. Some of the other elements that are so crucial, things like identifying goals. Virtually none of the plans had adequately described goals. Virtually none of the plans had good quality communication, so how that plan is actually going to be communicated and therefore implemented by the staff team. There's also really low levels around actually teaching people alternative behaviours and really low levels around the use of reinforcement. So behaviour support plans are really good at describing behaviour, fairly good at describing reactive strategies also, but not brilliant at the implementation side of things, and not brilliant at being constructional, at actually giving people the adequate skills they need to not engage in those challenging behaviours in the first place. So I find that a really interesting graph to look at actually. So as we know, one of the sort of core purposes of this study was to look at the levels of restrictive intervention in relation to high or low quality behaviour support plans. And these next tables that I'm going to be showing to you look at those numbers. They focus specifically on chemical restraints, so the use of PRM medication, the use of seclusion and the use of mechanical restraints. So those are the 3 categories. And then those are formulated into a total. And as we can see here, when we're looking at low quality plans, the actual mean number of episodes is increased from the pre to post measure. So that's certainly not a positive outcome. Whereas looking at the high quality plans, there's been a reduction in the use of restrictive intervention. So that's a really great outcome. So this next graph that I'm showing you now, this actually focuses in on the element that the researchers wanted to build upon from their previous research, which is looking at particular elements within the behaviour support plan that will lead to a more positive outcome in relation to restrictive interventions. So they looked at 9 of the 12 components and they differentiated the individual scores for each component. So anything that scored a 2 was deemed as being high quality. Anything that scored less than a 2 was deemed as being of poor quality. They weren't able to analyse 3 of the components because there weren't enough high quality scores to make it a relevant analysis. So they looked at the difference between the poor and high quality scores in relation to restrictive intervention. So the bars that go up mean that there was an increase in restrictive intervention related to that component, and the bars that go down, that means that there was a reduction in restrictive intervention. So there's some really sort of interesting things here, I think, on this graph. The first one being around the behaviours. It appears from the graph that actually describing the behaviour in itself has very little impact on the reduction of restrictive intervention. And that's not really massively surprising. It's not all that important to actually understand what the behaviour is. Quite a lot of the support workers will be well aware of that anyway. It's actually, how are we going to address that? How are we going to sort of implement changes that are going to make a positive impact? I think the really important and interesting thing that's highlighted on this graph is around the functions and around the goals elements, the ones that I've circled here. Those behaviour support plans that had high quality sections around function were linked to quite a dramatic reduction in restrictive interventions. So staff having a good understanding of the function of that challenging behaviour has a really positive impact. And also having goals identified clearly has a positive impact as well. So those particular elements were really highlighted by the researchers being significant. So looking at the discussion around this research, first of all, the researchers focused on the direct, obvious implications for the design of behaviour support plans. So one of the key things that came out of that particular component analysis really honed in on the importance of a functional approach to behaviour. those behaviour support plans that were of good quality and that had a really good quality section around function were the most likely ones to lead to a reduction in the use of restrictive interventions. So really making sure that behaviour support plans are built on that sort of functional perspective, built on functional behavioural assessments and analyses, I think really crucial part of the design. Also really implicated in the study was the focus on ensuring that behaviour support plans have really clear outcomes and objectives, and that these are measurable and achievable, and that all staff are aware of them and are working towards the same goals and outcomes. Again, that's something that really needs to be built into that behaviour support plan design. Secondly, the researchers focused on the implications around workforce development, how we're skilling up the people that are actually going to be designing the behaviour support plans. Simply defining the behaviour is not enough, and there are too many behaviour support plans, from my experience and probably from my colleagues' experience, that are built around a really long description around all of the behaviours that person might engage in, and also really long descriptions around what staff need to do when those behaviours are occurring, but not enough actual focus around how we can support that person not to engage in those behaviours anymore. The researchers also identified some limitations related to the study. The first one being the fact that they were unable to analyse all the components of the BSP QE2. 3 of the components didn't have enough high scores to make that analysis relevant between the low and the high. The 3 elements that they weren't able to analyse were the teaching of alternative behaviours, the use of reinforcers, and the reviewing of the behaviour support plan. These are 3 elements that the researchers and myself as well really do feel that would have made a significant impact on the use of restrictive intervention had they been able to analyse them. If people aren't skilled up in alternative behaviours they can engage in, then they're going to be using that alternative behaviour. It's the most effective means of meeting that need. So that's a really crucial component to have right in a behaviour support plan. The same around actually understanding and utilising the use of reinforcement to help people develop those skills. And lastly, that reviewing of the behaviour support plan, which they weren't able to analyse in depth, but they were able to do a little bit of a qualitative analysis on the behaviour support plans that were coming in. And we're seeing some behaviour support plans that were not being changed from one year to the next. And as they state, if a behaviour support plan hasn't worked in that first year, it's not going to be working in the second year. There need to be some changes, there needs to be some reviewing to the content of that. They also talk about further examinations of other dimensions of restrictive intervention going forward as well. So they only focused on frequency, so the actual number of times that restrictive intervention happened. They didn't focus in on, for example, the duration of seclusion or the type of chemical restraint that was used. So again, looking in more detail at some of those other dimensions of measurement around those restrictive interventions. The researchers conclude by talking about some possible areas for future research. The first one being the degree of implementation. So they didn't actually analyse, to what degree behaviour support plans were being followed and implemented. I think they describe the fact that they can make a decent assumption that those behaviour support plans were implemented to an extent because of the positive outcomes in relation to restrictive interventions, but they didn't actually look at in detail how those behaviour support plans were implemented. They talked about looking further into strong leadership for prevention. Again, workforce development, with the best sort of training techniques for developing people in creating really positive and good quality behaviour support plans. The use of debriefing staff and debriefing the individual post use of restrictive intervention being a really important area to focus in on. What do those debriefs look like? How are we building what we learn from those debriefs into, evolving behaviour support plans effectively? And then those legislative frameworks that foster an agenda for prevention. So they were able to carry out their research in an area in which there's a real legislative framework that focuses in on the reduction of those restrictive interventions. And as we know, in not every context is that relevant. Is that something that needs to be picked up on? Is there something that needs to be put into place? So that leads into our own thoughts, sort of leading on from really reviewing and analysing this really interesting study. The first point, really, a huge one that I go on about quite regularly, is implementation. We can have the most shiny, beautifully written, colour-coded flowcharts included behaviour support plan that's confined to the very back of a support plan or someone's care records, and is looked at. Maybe it's got a read and sign sheet on the front of it that staff sign when they maybe skim read it, and it's actually not being implemented. It's not making any difference to that person's life. Behaviour support plans need to be really cascaded to the staff team. Staff need to be trained in that behaviour support plan. They need to feel it, to live it, and to breathe it. We need competency training where we're assessing staff's understanding of it. A second point is around the actual inconsistency around behaviour support planning, and not just around the way that behaviour support plans are implemented, but actually in what they look like. We're in a situation where we go from provider to provider and see lots of different formats of behaviour support plan, many of which contain similar elements but quite often are approached from a very different angle. Do we need to have more of a consistent overview around what behaviour support plans actually look like? What are the key crucial elements of a behaviour support plan? And accessibility, finding that balance between the technical, which is obviously really crucial, and the accessible, so that staff are able to actually understand what's being expected of them, and are able to read something relatively quickly and get that information, the really crucial information. And the quality checking of behaviour support plans. How often should this be taking place? Is it taking place? Very rarely, I think, we go into organisations that are reviewing and checking behaviour support plans for quality, that they contain all of the relevant elements. We've talked about a tool that can be used, that's the BSP QE2. Does that cover all the elements? I think there's a question around that. That's not the only tool that can be used to review behaviour support plans. It doesn't look in great detail at some of the really important elements around quality of life. And finally, what do we do if a plan isn't working? If it's not working, it's not correct. We need to be sort of changing the elements within that behaviour support plan to make it work for that person. So that comes from that evaluation process. That's really crucial, and ties in with things like debriefs, but also it ties in with things like looking at positive outcomes for people, not just focusing on the challenging behaviours that are occurring, but focusing on where things are improving for people. Do we need to change elements of the plan because that person's doing really well and this isn't as relevant anymore? So that fact that plans shouldn't be static. They should be documents that evolve and grow with that person. So I think that's a really important sort of thought that I had and that we had, following reviewing this article. So that's me wrapped up. Thanks loads for listening. Hopefully you've seen it through to the end. And watch this space for more information on more Dissemination Day from other members of PBS UK.